Hello there, everybody. So I thought it'd be useful to take a look at reasons why owner operators sometimes fail. You don't want to wish bad luck on anybody. Sometimes it does come down to luck. They ran into some bad luck and then they didn't make it. It's like, well, why do some guys not make it? If they have the willpower, can't they make it? I would say it's easier nowadays with the newer, better warranties on the trucks to make it. But generally, from what I've seen over the past 10 years that I've been an owner operator, I've heard many stories and seen many instances where guys did not make it. They did not succeed for a variety of reasons. A lot of it has to do with money. Truck repairs not covered under warranty could knock you out of business. It's one of these things where the older trucks, the older Cascadia 125 models, for example, were not under warranty, and one box would frequently go out. These are the early trucks that when these systems were first installed on the trucks, they were terrible. You know, EGR and DEF when that first came out, and I think 2010. You start out with EPA 10, and now we're up to EPA 21 or something like that. So those early versions of those EPA trucks were terrible, absolutely terrible. Money pits. Guys would call dealerships, because you take your truck in there and they tell you need a new EGR or a new DEF wire harness. DEF was really bad. New knock sensors, brand new one box. You're talking $10,000 to $20,000. And you might say, well, yeah, okay, you can handle that. And then the next month it'll be another $10,000, and then the month after that it'll be another $5,000. And so the repairs was one of the reasons why guys don't make it. They just can't keep up with repairs. I've had guys tell me they tried it, and it just was like they would run miles to the next breakdown, pay for that breakdown, run miles to the next breakdown. And they just got tired of it. They're like, look, I'm better off as a company driver, and they gave up on being a small business owner. So repairs is a big one. Another one is taxes. For some reason, some guys didn't pay their taxes. you know, it's like you got to pay your taxes. I mean, that's mandatory. You got to pay taxes. So I've heard stories where you know guys didn't pay their taxes till the end of the year. They go to file their annual returns and they owe $20,000 of taxes. They don't have the money, and that knocked them out of business. It's like really can't do accounting on your own when you're running a small business, small trucking company. When I file my tax return, it's like 40 pages long. I don't understand it. It's the tax code. Even when the accountant who's trying to explain it to me, I just nod my head. I'm like, okay, if you say so, it sounds good. How much do I have to pay? That's what I want to know. Um, it's very complicated. And if you try to do taxes on your own, this could be one of the reasons why you fail as a small business owner, is because taxes are too complicated. You don't pay your taxes, you're going to have a large tax bill, and you're going to have to pay it. There's no way you're not going to pay it. So I see breakdowns. The cost of repairs knock guys out of business, and then taxes can knock guys out of business. A third one I would say is like a partnership. I've seen this over the years where you have two brothers or two friends. You buy a truck together and they think they're going to run a business together. And there's an old saying in the business community is that the only ship that will not sail is a partnership. And why is that? It's because they constantly fight over money and decisions and power between the two. So these guys when they get in these partnerships, sometimes it causes the business to fail because they cannot keep it together. And you see this in all types of businesses, family businesses. Anytime that there's multiple business owners for a single business, it's a level of complexity. And it's like you can't deal with one person. You got to get approval from both of them. Like if something needs to be decided, one person can't decide on their own because they're not the sole owner. They got to consult with their partner. And it's a terrible way to run a business. So sometimes partnerships fail. That could be husband and wife, could be brothers, could be family business, whatever. When there's more than one owner, those sometimes fail. So there's three instances where owner operators fail. They fail because of costly repairs. They fail because of taxes. They fail because of some kind of partnership scenario. So let's think about another fourth one. A reason why they sometimes fail is they don't. They when a guy first goes to buy a truck, they sometimes they'll make one of two decisions. They'll buy a truck they can't afford. That will cause them to fail. Or they buy the crappiest, oldest truck that they could find, and that caused them to fail. So it's like they buy a truck that the truck payments are too much and they can't handle it. Or they buy a truck, especially from another owner operator. They buy a truck that's got 800,000 or 900,000 miles on it, and they think that they're going to be successful, because it was cheap. But then it has like some kind of catastrophic failure, and they don't have the money because the reason why they bought it in the first place was because it was cheap. So it probably means they don't have a lot of money saved up for maintenance either. So the first time it breaks down, they're out of business. So you see all these different reasons why guys fail, and then I would say the fifth one is that their heart is just not in it. They thought as a company driver that they wanted to become an owner operator. They sounded great. It's like, well, in theory, this sounds great. You could take time off whenever you want. You can go on expensive vacations. You can, make all this money, and then they find out that it's none of that. It's a 24/7 operation. So that you can never really take vacation time off when you're running a small business. You always got to do something for the small business. You're going to have to run the miles. You're going to have to be a road warrior. And the paperwork requirements, the compliance requirements, the taxes, everything. It's a lot of work, and it's more than what they bargained for. And then so their heart's just not in it, and they just decide they don't want to be an owner operator. And there's five common reasons I think of why guys sometimes don't make it. A lot of it has to do with finances. People just can't manage their money. They don't save for expensive truck repairs. They don't save for taxes, and they're not making any progress if they're not saving any money. So if they're not saving money, then they're probably better off as a company driver. You know, Elon Musk, which he's a great entrepreneur. Um, he celebrates failure. He's like, if you're not failing, you're not trying hard enough. So when you think about all those rockets that he launches and they keep exploding, it's very expensive for those rockets to not make it back to the ground safely. He builds another one, launches it again, and eventually they'll figure it out. It can be that way too as an owner operator. Your first attempt trying to be an owner operator, maybe things didn't go smoothly. But, if you want to try again, you can. Learn from your past experiences. I've talked to guys who are getting back into it now that there's better warranties on these trucks. Yeah, they're interested. We may have tried it in the past and, got a little bit snake bit. It's like once you get bit, it's like you once bitten, twice shy. You don't want to do that again. But it takes a lot for them to overcome that fear of being bit again. And one thing they learned is that how important saving money is. Just like the first time I bought a truck, I wasn't really ready for it, and it hit me all at once, and it knocked them out. Knocked them out of business. It's like, well, the second time coming around, they got a better idea of what it's going to take. So they understand if they jump back into it that they got to have the financial strength. I'm not opposed to guys having credit cards, because credit cards can come in handy with truck repairs if we manage it responsibly. I know financial advisors may tell you don't have any credit cards, but it's awful hard to run a business if you don't have credit cards. If you start out on a shoestring budget and you don't have any credit, I mean, you're almost doomed to fail from the very beginning. I look at credit cards, and I recommended two credit cards. I recommended the American Express Business Plum Card, and that gives you 60 days to pay with no interest. And then I also recommended the Navy Federal Credit Union Business Card. That they gave me a $25,000 credit limit on that. And when you think about these expensive truck repairs, let's say it is a $10,000 repair. You probably could pay that off within 60 days. You get the truck back on the road. Do what it takes to get back on the road, short of it being a blown engine. I've had that happen before, and I wasn't going to put that on the credit card. But I think these are a lot of the common reasons why guys fail. It's around finances and the warranty of the truck. If their finances were stronger, or if the warranties were stronger, they'd probably still be in business. But some guys, they just can't manage money. If they make money, they spend it as fast as they make it. That's disaster in the making. Some guys have what is called lifestyle creep. They start making more money, so they start spending more money. So that they start making money as an owner operator, and what do they go do? They go buy a new car, and it's like, you're not gonna drive that car. I got a personal vehicle. I paid cash for it, and I only put like 5,000 miles or less on it because I'm in the truck, not in the car. Why would you want to go spend money on a car? See, this is the things that guys do that screws them up. They get this lifestyle creep. They're like, well, now I can afford a new car. So they go buy a new car and they park it at the terminal, just like they did with their old car. You don't need a new car. You may need a car. I have a pickup that I like, but it's got over 100,000 miles on it, which is fine. I don't need a brand new pickup. I mean, good God, those things are expensive. So what do? They buy cars, they buy motorcycles, they buy boats, they buy RVs, they buy toys. They buy a lot of toys. And when the truck breaks down, they don't have any money to pay for truck repairs because they spend it all on their toys. Or they spend it on housing, or they spend it on girlfriends and spouses. And, some of that's necessary, no doubt. But you got to think about why do owner-operators fail? It's like they make bad decisions, mostly. And it's mostly decisions about money. So pay attention to when guys are telling stories and they ask you like, oh, you're an owner-operator, and you're like, yeah, and they're like, I tried that, and I didn't work, and you find out why it didn't work. They got a story behind why it didn't work. Usually they're blaming somebody else. It's like, well, I got screwed by a dealer, or I got screwed by the company. There are those companies that lease trucks. So, that's the lease purchase program that Congress is taking a look at and making it illegal to do going forward. Those arrangements put a lot of guys out of business. They would lease them company trucks. The guy never owned the truck. And then at the end of the lease, the guy spent all his money leasing the truck. He has no money. And then sometimes these have like balloon payments or other types of payments that they're required to pay if they want to keep their truck, and they don't have the money for the truck. It was a total ripoff. Um, I think they had a lot of problems with that in California. That's why they came out with California AB5. Um, it was trying to protect these independent contractors, which I'm an independent contractor, but I own my truck. But they were leasing trucks, and the guys, they were making less than minimum wage. So that would knock you out of business. Those lease truck purchase programs. So it's something to be aware of. This can help you stay on track if you understand why guys go out of business or fail as an owner operator. If you understand what happened to them, then you can keep that in the back of your mind and say, look, got to watch out for these types of scenarios. And there's good years and there's bad years. There's no doubt about it. And the more money you have saved up, the better you're going to be able to weather through those tough years. Those tough, I've had years where a truck broke down so many times. I had like almost no profit for the entire year. And that's tough. But you learn a lot. You learn a lot from failing, and doesn't mean it's the end of the road. It's like Elon Musk. He's failed 100 times on them rockets, but he finally got it right. You know, if you got the desire to become an owner operator and you failed before, there's nothing stopping you from trying again. Just keep learning. There's probably some times early on when I started out that it's just a matter of luck that I didn't fail. But I was pretty determined. It was like, I'm going to make this work somehow, some way. 10 years later, it's working. Went through a lot, but learned a lot along the way as well. All right, guys. Well, that's all I got for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the internet.